What's up, Spikes? We're back. This game, we're calling it cEDH. It's kind of on the fringe of cEDH. None of these are really meta decks at the moment, but there isn't really a great name for where we're playing at today. First in turn order, we've got Arctic Blast. If you're on our Discord server, the link's in the description, you'll recognize Arctic as one of our mods. He's playing Shuffle Atla today. This is a deck that uses Atla's ability, as well as Mirror Entity, to repeatedly polymorph creatures and cycle through all the creatures in the deck. As the creatures die, they get shuffled back into the library with Eldrazi Titans, and it usually finishes the game with a Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker combo. Next up, Elliot is playing Thrasios and Tymna. This is a stacksy mid-rangey kind of build that looks to win with Thassa's Oracle. Third in turn order, we've got Aaron playing Jeska Isha. This is a Jeskai deck that focuses a lot on getting Isha into play and beating in for damage. Jeska can triple Isha's damage, making it a big threat real early. And finally, Jerry's playing Mono Red Ragavan. This is another stacks deck that leans really heavily on effects like Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. And with that, let's get right into it. On turn 1, Arctic draws a card, plays a Spire Garden untapped, and casts Quirion Ranger. It resolves and he passes. Elliot draws a card, plays a Bloodstained Mire, and cracks it going to 39, grabbing a Bayou. He uses the Bayou to cast Noble Hierarch, then passes the turn. Aaron draws a card, plays a Bloodstained Mire, and cracks it going to 39, grabbing a Volcanic Island. He casts a Mystic Remora. When it resolves, he passes. Jerry draws, plays an Urza's Saga on 1, and exiles Simian Spirit Guide to add a red, dashing in Ragavan. He moves to combat, attacking Elliot. There's no blocks, and Elliot goes to 37. Jerry makes a treasure, and Elliot exiles Fyndhorn Elves off the top of his library. Jerry sacks the treasure he just made to cast that Fyndhorn Elves, and when it resolves, he passes the turn, returning Ragavan to his hand. Arctic untaps and draws a card. He plays a Wooded Foothills and cracks it going to 39. He grabs a Savannah. He moves to combat and attacks Aaron for 1. There's no blocks, so Aaron goes to 38, then Arctic passes. Elliot untaps, draws a card, and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it going to 36, grabbing a Tundra. He casts his commander Thrasios Triton Hero and passes. Aaron untaps and pays for Mystic Remora. He draws a card, plays an Ancient Tomb, and passes the turn. Jerry untaps, draws a card, and takes up Urza's Saga to 2. He plays a mountain and casts Captain Lannery Storm. He moves to combat, attacking Aaron, making a treasure. There's no block, so Aaron goes to 36. Jerry cracks his treasure to cast Ragavan. Arctic responds by flashing in Cathar Commando. Then Ragavan resolves, and Jerry passes. Arctic kicks off turn 3 by untapping and drawing a card. He plays a forest, then moves to combat. Arctic attacks Aaron with Cathar Commando, and there's no block, so Aaron takes 3 going to 33. Then Arctic passes. Elliot untaps, draws a card, and plays a Morphic Pool untapped. He casts Tymna. He moves to combat, attacking Aaron with Noble Hierarch. This triggers Exalted, and there's no block, so Aaron takes 1 going to 32. In Elliot's second main, he pays a life and draws a card, then passes. Aaron untaps, and on the upkeep, Mystic Remora gets a second age counter. He pays for it with Ancient Tomb, taking 2 going to 30. He draws a card, plays a Misty Rainforest, and passes. Jerry untaps and draws a card. Urza's Saga triggers, and Jerry holds priority, tapping it to add 1 colorless. The trigger resolves, and Jerry searches up Sol Ring and puts it into play. He plays a mountain as his land for turn, then casts Grenzo Havoc Razor. He moves to combat, and the colorless drains from his mana pool. He swings Lannery Storm at Arctic, and Ragavan and Fyndhorn Elves at Aaron. This triggers Captain Lannery Storm, making Jerry a treasure. Before blocks, Arctic flashes in Endurance. With the ETB ability, he targets Elliot to put his fetches on the bottom of his library. Arctic blocks Lannery Storm with Endurance, and Aaron declares no blocks, taking 3. The damage triggers Ragavan and Grenzo. Jerry opts to exile the top 2 cards of Aaron's library, which are Enlightened Tutor and Dispel. Then the Ragavan trigger resolves, exiling Aaron's Mana Crypt. Then Jerry makes a treasure. In his post-combat main, Jerry casts Mana Crypt, not paying for Mystic Remora, so Aaron finally gets to draw a card. Jerry cracks a treasure to cast Dragon's Rage Channeler. He cracks another treasure to cast Thrill of Possibility, discarding Grim Monolith. This triggers Dragon's Rage Channeler and Mystic Remora, and Jerry doesn't pay. Then he surveils 1, moving a mountain from his library to his graveyard. Then he resolves the spell by drawing 2 cards from Thrill of Possibility. He casts a Mox Opal, again not paying for Mystic Remora, so Aaron draws another card. Then Jerry casts Aaron's Enlightened Tutor, triggering Mystic Remora and the Dragon Rage Channeler again, and in response, Aaron cracks his Misty Rainforest, grabbing a Tundra. Still in response, Aaron flashes in Archivist of Ogma, then resolves his Mystic Remora trigger to draw a card. Jerry surveils Splinter Twin to his graveyard, then resolves Enlightened Tutor, searching up Court of Ire and putting it on top of his library. Jerry searching triggers the Archivist, and Aaron draws another card and gains a life going to 27. And Jerry passes. Arctic kicks off turn 4 by untapping, drawing a card, and playing a Taiga. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Quirion Ranger, triggering Mystic Remora, so Aaron draws a card. He resolves Eldritch Evolution, searching up Archon of Emeria. This triggers Archivist of Ogma, and Aaron gains 1 and draws another card. Then Arctic passes. Elliot untaps, draws a card, and plays a Polluted Delta tapped because of Archon of Emeria. He moves to combat, attacking Tymna into Aaron, which triggers Exalted. Aaron doesn't block and takes 3 damage. Elliot gains 3 life off lifelink, then moves to second main and loses 1 life and draws a card. He casts Bloom Tender, then passes. Aaron untaps, doesn't pay for Mystic Remora, and then he draws a card for turn. He plays Exotic Orchard, which enters tapped. He casts a Jeweled Lotus and moves to his end step, discarding Marsh Flats, Plateau, Spectator Seating, and Sea of Clouds to hand size, then passes the turn. Jerry untaps, and in his upkeep, Mana Crypt triggers. He loses the flip and takes 3. Then he draws a card for turn, moves to combat, and swings Ragavan and Grenzo at Aaron. He also swings Dragon Rage Channeler at Elliot, and there's no blocks all around. Elliot takes 3 and Aaron takes 4. This triggers Grenzo and Ragavan. Aaron reveals Plaza of Heroes, Luca Coppercoat Outcast, and Kedis Emberclaw Familiar. In his post-combat main, Jerry casts Court of Ire. Elliot responds by casting Mana Drain, countering the Court of Ire, and with nothing left to do, Jerry passes to Arctic. On turn 5, Arctic untaps and draws a card. He plays a Misty Rainforest, cracking it going to 38, getting a Temple Garden, entering untapped, taking an additional 2 going to 36. This search triggers the Archivist, and Aaron draws another card and gains a life going to 22. Arctic casts Atla Palani. Aaron responds by casting Force of Will, pitching Flusterstorm, and taking 1 going back down to 21. Thoroughly thwarted, Arctic passes. Elliot untaps, draws a card, and in his pre-combat main phase, he adds 5 colorless mana from the Mana Drain. He activates Thrasios with 1 colorless floating. Elliot scries 1 to the top, then reveals the Savannah and puts it on the battlefield tapped. He then activates Thrasios again, this time with a green floating. He scries 1 to the bottom and reveals Fabro Elder, putting it into his hand. He then casts it, and when it resolves, he passes to Aaron. Aaron untaps, draws a card, and plays Urza's Saga on 1. Then he sacrifices Jeweled Lotus for white, and casts Ishai. Elliot responds by cracking Polluted Delta, going down to 33 and grabbing a snow-covered island. The search again triggers Archivist of Ogma, and Aaron gains a life going to 22 and draws a card. Then Aaron passes. Jerry untaps, flips for Mana Crypt in his upkeep, and loses again, taking 3. He moves to combat, swinging Dragon Rage Channeler at Elliot, and Ragavan and Grenzo at Aaron. Elliot takes 3, and Aaron takes 4. Grenzo triggers for the Dragon Rage Channeler damage, and Elliot exiles a Swan Song. Then Ragavan triggers, exiling Aaron's Mox Opal, and then Grenzo triggers twice for itself and Ragavan. Aaron exiles Hallowed Fountain and Essior, warding Familiar. Jerry casts Essior, which triggers Ishai. Then Jerry passes. Arctic untaps on turn 6 and draws a card. He plays a Sunbaked Canyon as his land for turn. He pays 1 mana and sacrifices it to draw a card, then moves to combat. He attacks Aaron with Cathar Commando, and attacks Elliot with the Archon of Emeria. There's no blocks all around, so Elliot takes 2 and Aaron takes 3. Arctic moves to his end step, and Elliot wants to act, casting Mystical Tutor, triggering Ishai. Arctic responds by flashing in Aven Mind Sensor, triggering Ishai again. The Ishai trigger resolves. Then Elliot resolves Mystical Tutor by searching his top 4 and failing to find an instant or sorcery. This search triggers Archivist of Ogma, and Aaron gains 1 and draws a card. Arctic then continues to pass the turn. Elliot untaps and draws a card. He casts Phantasmal Image, triggering Ishai. It enters as a copy of Grenzo Havoc Raiser. Then Elliot moves to combat, swinging the Fabro Elder at Jerry, who chump blocks with his Fyndhorn Elves. Being that that's Elliot's Fyndhorn Elves, it goes back to Elliot's graveyard when it dies. In his second main phase, Elliot channels Otawara, targeting Archon of Emeria. Jerry responds by casting Deflecting Swat to redirect the trigger to Ishai. The swat triggers Ishai, which briefly gets a 5th counter before it gets bounced back to Aaron's hand. Then Elliot passes. Aaron untaps and draws a card. He takes up Urza's Saga, then plays Mana Confluence. He casts Ishai, taking 2 from the Ancient Tomb. This resolves, and he passes the turn, discarding Intuition to hand size. Jerry untaps, and in his upkeep, he flips for Mana Crypt and takes no damage. He draws a card for turn, then moves to combat. He swings Dragon Rage Channeler at Elliot, and Essior, Grenzo, and Ragavan at Aaron. Aaron blocks Grenzo with Archivist of Ogma, and Elliot declares no blocks. So when the Channeler connects for 3 damage, it triggers Grenzo, exiling Boseiju off the top of Elliot's library. Aaron takes 2 from Ragavan and 1 for Esior. This triggers Ragavan's ability to exile Talisman of Creativity and make Jerry a treasure. It also triggers Grenzo twice, exiling Deflecting Swat and Miscast. Jerry casts Arcane Signet, triggering Ishai and Dragon Ray's Channeler, and Jerry surveils a mountain to the graveyard, then passes to Arctic. Arctic kicks off turn 7 by untapping and drawing a card. He plays Boseiju as his land for turn, then casts Ranger Captain of Eos, triggering Ishai. When it enters the battlefield, Ranger Captain's own ability triggers, and Arctic searches for Allosaurus Shepherd and puts it in his hand. He then moves to combat, attacking Jerry with the Archon and the Aven Mind Sensor. Jerry declares no blocks and takes 4 damage, going to 30. Arctic moves to his end step, and Elliot taps Bloom Tender for Wooburg and activates Thrasios, floating a blue. He scries a card to the bottom, reveals a snow-covered forest, and puts it into play tapped. He taps the Fabro Elder for another Wooburg, this time floating blue-blue, and activates Thrasios again. He scries a card to the bottom, and reveals Diabolic Intent, putting it in his hand. He activates Thrasios a 3rd time, scrying to the bottom, and revealing Eldritch Evolution, putting it into his hand. Then Arctic continues to pass the turn. Elliot untaps and draws a card. He moves to combat, attacking Jerry with the Fabro Elder and the Noble Hierarch triggers. Jerry declares no blocks and takes a total of 6 damage. Elliot's Grenzo triggers this time, and Jerry exiles his own Mox Amber. In his post-combat main, he loses a life and draws a card. As his one spell this turn, Elliot casts Aura of Silence, triggering Ishai. He moves to his end step, discarding Elvish Mystic to hand size and passing the turn. Aaron untaps, draws a card, and his Urza's Saga ticks up to 3. Aaron holds priority on it and taps it for a mana, then lets the Saga trigger resolve. He searches the top 4 and puts Sol Ring directly into play. He plays an Arid Mesa, which comes in tapped due to the Archon, and casts his own Ragavan, which then resolves, and he passes the turn. Jerry untaps and flips for Mana Crypt, taking no damage in his upkeep. He plays a mountain, then casts Sword of the Animist, triggering Ishai. This also triggers Dragon Rage Channeler, and he surveils a gamble to his graveyard. He equips the sword to the Dragon Rage Channeler and moves to combat, attacking Elliot. This triggers the Sword of the Animist, and he looks at the top 4 and fails to find a land. Elliot declares no blocks and takes 4 damage, going to 20. Then Jerry passes. Arctic kicks off turn 8 by untapping, drawing a card, and playing a Forbidden Orchard. He casts Allosaurus Shepherd, triggering Ishai, then moves to combat. He attacks Jerry with Archon of Emeria, and Jerry blocks with Esior. He moves to his end step, and Elliot casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting Aven Mind Sensor. Aaron responds by overloading Cyclonic Rift. Elliot responds to that by sacrificing his Aura of Silence to pop Aaron's Sol Ring. The activation resolves. Then Elliot, still in Arctic's end step, activates Thrasios, scrying 1 to the top and revealing a Mana Crypt, putting it in his hand. He activates Thrasios again, scrying 1 to the top, revealing a Breeding Pool and putting it into play tapped. Then activates Thrasios one more time, scrying 1 to the top, revealing a Windswept Heath and putting it into play tapped. Then they resolve Aaron's Cyclonic Rift, and Jerry's Mana Crypt and Esior go back to Aaron's hand. Then they resolve the Ishai trigger from Elliot's Assassin's Trophy, and with the stack empty, Arctic flashes in the Aven Mind Sensor, triggering Ishai again. Arctic continues to pass the turn to Elliot. Elliot untaps, draws a card, and casts Carpet of Flowers, triggering Ishai. He casts a Mana Crypt, triggering Ishai again, then moves to combat, and there's no attacks. In his second main, he triggers Carpet of Flowers, choosing Aaron and adding white. He recasts Tymna, triggering Ishai. He casts a Fabro Elder, triggering Ishai again, then casts Phantasmal Image, triggering Ishai a 3rd time. It enters as a copy of Aven Mind Sensor. He then casts his Bloom Tender, triggering Ishai again, and moves to his end step, discarding Elves of Deep Shadow to hand size. Aaron untaps, draws a card, and casts Displacer Kitten, taking 2 off Ancient Tomb, going to 9. He moves to combat. He swings Ragavan at Jerry and Ishai at Elliot. Elliot blocks with his Aven Mind Sensor, and Jerry takes 2, exiling Academy Manufactor to the Ragavan trigger. And Aaron makes a treasure token. He casts Mana Crypt, triggering his kitten to blink Ragavan. He casts Arcane Signet, blinking Mana Crypt. He floats a red with Arcane Signet, then casts Lotus Petal to blink it. At this point, he's got 2 colorless and a red floating, which he uses to cast Wheel of Fortune. This triggers Displacer Kitten, and Aaron targets his Mana Crypt, blinking it. Arctic responds by casting Endurance, exiling Allosaurus Shepherd and triggering Ishai. When Endurance enters, it sacrifices itself and puts Aaron's graveyard on the bottom of his library. Arctic continues to respond by flashing in Cathar Commando. This triggers Ishai again, and when the Cathar Commando resolves and enters, he activates it, targeting Mana Crypt. This gives Jerry a 1/1 Spirit off of Forbidden Orchard. The wheel resolves, and Aaron discards Dovin's Veto, Lavinia, and Essior. Jerry discards Mox Opal, Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, Mana Crypt, Sword of the Animist, Dragon Raid's Channeler, and Ragavan, which goes back to the command zone. Arctic discards Mog Raider, Ranger Captain of Eos, Archon of Emeria, and Forerunner of the Legion. Elliot discards Spellseeker, Eldritch Evolution, Diabolic Intent, Dark Confidant, Mystic Remora, Noble Hierarch, and Thrasios, which goes back to his command zone. All 4 players draw 7 cards. Then Aaron casts Dockside Extortionist. Arctic responds by evoking Solitude, exiling Lauren of the Third Path, triggering Ishai. It resolves, and when it enters, it triggers its own ability, targeting Displacer Kitten. Aaron responds by casting Swords to Plowshares, targeting Bloom Tender, which triggers the Displacer Kitten again, attempting to blink itself to sidestep the Solitude. Jerry responds by casting Pyroblast, targeting the Displacer Kitten, triggering Ishai again. Aaron casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Pyroblast, which triggers the Displacer Kitten again, this time targeting Arcane Signet. Then we go to resolve the stack. The Kitten trigger resolves, blinking Arcane Signet. Pyroblast is countered, and Jerry makes 2 treasures. Aaron adds a counter to Ishai. Then Displacer Kitten blinks itself. Swords to Plowshares resolves, exiling Bloom Tender, and Elliot gains 1 life. Aaron adds a counter to Ishai. Then Solitude's ETB ability fails to resolve because Displacer Kitten is a new object. Then Dockside Extortionist enters the battlefield, triggering its own ability and making 4 treasures. Aaron casts Savin's Reclamation, targeting Essior, which triggers Displacer Kitten again, targeting Dockside Extortionist. It blinks, making 4 more treasures, then Reclamation resolves, reanimating Essior. Aaron casts Mother of Runes, then he casts Jeska, triggering the Displacer Kitten, targeting Dockside to blink it, making 4 more treasures. Jeska resolves and enters with 2 counters on it. Aaron activates Jeska's minus ability, removing 2 counters and dealing 2 damage to Tymna, Fabro Elder, and Aven Mindsensor. He casts Jeska again, triggering the Displacer Kitten, targeting the Dockside Extortionist, making 4 more treasures. Jeska comes into play with 3 counters this time. Aaron cracks the Arid Mesa, going to 7, and Elliot responds, cracking his Windswept Teeth, going to 20. With the Aven Mindsensor out of the way, Elliot gets a Tropical Island, and Aaron gets a Plateau, and Aaron finally passes. Jerry untaps, draws a card, and plays a mountain. He casts Wheel of Fortune, triggering Ishai. Jerry discards Magus of the Moon, Brea's Apprentice, Professional Facebreaker, Breaches, and a mountain. Arctic discards Bountiful Promenade, Eternal Witness, Academy Rector, Village Bellringer, and Nullrod. Elliot discards Veil of Summer, Opposition Agent, Arbor Elf, Drannith Magistrate, Mana Confluence, Scalding Tarn, and Marsh Flats. Aaron discards Gemstone Caverns and Fierce Guardianship. Then everyone draws 7. Jerry casts Mox Diamond, pitching a mountain. He casts Jeska's Will, targeting Arctic. This resolves, and Jerry makes 7 red mana, triggering Ishai. He casts Wandering Archaic, and Arctic responds by casting Noxious Revival, targeting Eldritch Evolution in his graveyard. This triggers Ishai again. Aaron responds by casting Mystical Tutor, which triggers Displacer Kitten, targeting Dockside Extortionist. Jerry responds to the Kitten trigger by sacrificing his treasure to add a red. Then the trigger resolves, Dockside enters and makes 3 treasures. Mystical Tutor resolves, and Aaron puts Intuition on top of his library. The Ishai trigger resolves, then Noxious Revival resolves, and Arctic puts Eldritch Evolution on top of his library. Then the last Ishai trigger resolves, and Wandering Archaic resolves. With the stack empty, Jerry casts Ragavan, and when it resolves, he passes. Arctic untaps and draws a card. He casts a Soul Ring, triggering Ishai. He plays a Gyre Reach Sanitarium as land for turn, then activates it, causing each player to draw a card. Arctic then discards Flooded Strand, Elliot discards Waterlogged Grove, and Aaron discards Felwar Stone. Jerry discards a basic mountain. Arctic casts Drannith Magistrate, triggering Ishai again. Then he casts his own Dockside Extortionist. Aaron responds by sacrificing all of his treasures to cast Hullbreaker Horror. It resolves, and Aaron responds to the Dockside again by casting Force of Will, paying 1 life and pitching Cyclonic Rift, targeting Arctic's Dockside. This triggers the Displacer Kitten again, as well as the Hullbreaker Horror and Wandering Archaic. The Archaic trigger resolves first, copying Force of Will, targeting Aaron's Force of Will. The Hullbreaker Horror trigger bounces the Wandering Archaic, and the Displacer Kitten blinks Aaron's Dockside Extortionist again, making him another 4 treasures. Still in response to Arctic's Dockside Extortionist, Aaron casts Intuition, triggering the Hullbreaker Horror and Displacer Kitten again. The Displacer Kitten blinks Dockside Extortionist, making another 4 treasures. Then Hullbreaker Horror returns Elliot's Carpet of Flowers to his hand. Aaron then resolves his Intuition, searching up Grand Abolisher, Lion's Eye Diamond, and Brain Freeze. He chooses Elliot, and Elliot gives him Grand Abolisher to hand, with the other 2 going to the bin. Arctic's Dockside Extortionist resolves, and in response to the ETB trigger, Aaron again sacrifices all of his treasures and his Lotus Petal. so Arctic makes 3 treasures when the ability finally resolves. Arctic sacks his treasure and his Drannith Magistrate to cast Eldritch Evolution, triggering Isha again. They missed this trigger, but who can blame them? There's a lot going on right now. The Eldritch Evolution resolves, and Arctic searches up Skyclave Apparition. It enters, and the ETB trigger exiles Isha, and Arctic passes the turn. Elliot untaps, and triggers Mana Crypt, taking no damage. He draws a card, casts Thrasios, then follows it up with a Seedborn Muse. He plays Gaia's Cradle and recasts the Carpet of Flowers. He moves to his second main, and with his Carpet trigger, he chooses Aaron. Then he taps Gaia's Cradle for 2 to activate Thrasios, scrying 1 card to the bottom, and revealing Esper Sentinel to put it in his hand. Elliot passes the turn. On turn 9, Aaron untaps, and Elliot untaps. Then Aaron draws a card. Aaron casts Grand Abolisher, triggering Hullbreaker Horror, targeting the Dockside Extortionist. Elliot responds by activating Thrasios, scrying a card to the bottom, revealing Verdant Catacombs, and putting it into play tapped. He activates Thrasios again, scrying a card to the bottom, and revealing Sol Ring, putting it in his hand. He activates Thrasios again, scrying a card to the bottom, and revealing Imperial Seal, putting it in his hand. The Hullbreaker Horror trigger resolves, bouncing the Dockside Extortionist to Aaron's hand. Then the Grand Abolisher resolves, and Aaron demonstrates a loop by casting Dockside Extortionist, triggering Hullbreaker Horror, returning Mother of Runes to his hand. Dockside enters, making him 4 treasures, then he recasts the Mother of Runes, bouncing Dockside with the Hullbreaker trigger, completing the first iteration of the loop and netting 1 treasure. He repeats this loop 100,000 times and stops with Mother of Runes in play and Dockside Extortionist in his hand. With all these treasures, he activates Jeska to deal 3 to each opponent, sending it back to the command zone, then recasting it and having it enter with 4 counters. He's able to continue doing this until he's the last one standing, winning the game. What a game! This one clocked in at a little over 2 hours. And this might be our longest game summary we've ever done. And I guess that's what happens when you have 3 pretty stacksy decks at the table. Huge thanks to our guest Arctic Blast. We love you and appreciate you, and thank you so much for moderating our server. I want to give a huge shout out to all of our Patreon supporters, especially those on the screen right now. The support you give us helps us keep the lights on and keeps us making cool content like this every week. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, we'll catch you next time.